Welcome to WhiskyCast, cask strength conversation featuring news and interviews from the world of whiskey. I'm Mark Gillespie. This is episode number 840 for October 11th, 2020. Coming up in a few minutes.
It's a very different scene, and it's one that's driven by a desire to create either very high quality or very interesting, or both, spirits. And it's very unique. Every distillery is doing something different, and that's what I love about it.
The first ever English Whisky Festival is this coming weekend, and in addition to being a virtual festival, it's a sign of the future for English whiskeys. The fact that there are now enough of them to have a festival featuring English whiskeys. We'll have more on that story later on WhiskyCast in depth, with a bit of a surprise as well. That's coming up along with the What I'm Tasting This Week department, Your Voice, and on Behind the Label.
He bought 1,000 catfish fingerlings. He had the maintenance guys make this huge cage. They dropped it in a lake there on the property, and so they needed somebody to feed the fish. So I was the fish feeder.
The news is next on this week's WhiskyCast.
Hey whiskey fans, I'm Gabriel Cardarella, brand ambassador for the world's most awarded blended Scotch whiskey, Dewar's. You could probably guess I've got a lot of stories, but for me, the good ones have one thing in common. They're best told over a glass of whiskey. So hit pause, grab your bottle of Dewar's, and let's get back to this episode of WhiskyCast.
When you land on something special, you just know. Redbreast, the quintessential single pot still Irish whiskey, and a proud sponsor of WhiskyCast.
Let's get started with the news. With a new wave of coronavirus cases spreading through Europe, we are seeing both distilleries and pubs being affected by the latest public health restrictions. France has ordered all bars nationwide closed for at least the next 2 weeks, while Spain and Italy are imposing restrictions on a regional basis. Pub workers staged protests in Scotland, dumping piles of leftover ice outside the Scottish Parliament in Edinburgh and in Glasgow's George Square after government officials imposed new restrictions on pubs and restaurants in central Scotland that will run through at least October 25th. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson is expected to unveil new health restrictions in England Monday that could lead to new lockdowns in Manchester, Liverpool, and other cities. Ireland has also returned to Level 3 status nationwide, with pubs only allowed to offer outdoor dining for at least 2 more weeks, while the Netherlands has imposed a 10 p.m. mandatory closing time for all bars and restaurants. Germany is ordering bars, restaurants, and off-license stores in Berlin to close at 11 p.m. each night, while Belgian officials have ordered all bars and restaurants in Brussels closed for at least the next month, with slightly lesser restrictions for the rest of the country. In the U.S., where cases are also rising, Texas Governor Greg Abbott has now cleared the way for bars to start reopening on Wednesday in counties where local officials will allow it, but with a 50% capacity limit on indoor service. Wisconsin is seeing a surge in coronavirus cases, and that state's governor has now issued a statewide order limiting bars and restaurants to 25% of capacity until November 6th. And New York state officials have suspended liquor licenses for another 16 bars and restaurants statewide for violating coronavirus-related health restrictions. That brings the total so far to 217 suspensions statewide since the pandemic began. In other news, Jack Daniel's did not have to look very far to find a new master distiller after Jeff Arnett stepped down unexpectedly last month. Jack Daniel Distillery General Manager Larry Combs made the announcement at a news conference Wednesday.
This is an exciting day for all of us in Lynchburg and at Brown-Forman, and it is my distinct pleasure to turn it over to Chris Fletcher, the new master distiller for Jack Daniel's Tennessee Whiskey.
As was widely expected, Chris Fletcher becomes the 8th master distiller in Jack Daniel's history. He was assistant master distiller under Jeff Arnett for the last 6.5 years and is the grandson of Frank Bobo, who was master distiller from 1966 until 1989. Chris joined us on the Whiskey Wednesday webcast after the announcement. He admitted that the promotion came as a bit of a shock, but after being around the distillery since he was a kid, spending time with his grandfather, he is already right at home.
It was just a special place. Is the best way to describe it. And it's really awesome to be able to be in this role now as master distiller here at Jack Daniel's. And this is my grandfather's old office here that I was able to get. We've renovated a little bit over the years, but they even kept my old desk. That's one thing when I came back home in 2014, Jeff said, Chris, we've got this old desk that I know Jimmy used, and I think, your grandfather used it too before Jimmy. And so they saved it for me. A lot of people want new office furniture, but I'm never going to change mine.
As part of the announcement, Brown-Forman announced a new Distillers in Training program at the distillery. Chris Fletcher will be part of the leadership team for that program, which will identify internal candidates for distillery training with the goal of improving the company's record on diversity and inclusion. You can watch the entire interview with Chris Fletcher and listen to the audio from Wednesday's news conference in the news section at WhiskyCast.com. Down the road from Lynchburg in Tullahoma, and around the same time as the Jack Daniel's announcement, Diageo unveiled a new Tennessee whiskey brand from its Cascade Hollow Distilling Company, which is best known as the home of George Dickel Tennessee whiskey. Cascade Moon will be a range of limited edition whiskeys created by Cascade Hollow's Nicole Austin, who joined me for an online chat this week.
It was sort of a point of inspiration, but it's jumped off, from there. And this whiskey is about thinking about the future, and like what might the future of whiskey be like? And things that are really different, that don't fit in Dickel at all, and stuff that you would not do with a 150-year-old heritage brand, So it's fun. I'm excited. It's meant to be a whole series. So this first Cascade Moon is edition 1, which obviously implies that hopefully there will be a 2 and, God willing, a 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10,
Cascade Moon edition number 1 debuts in Tennessee, California, and Texas this fall for around $90 a bottle. A second release is expected later this year. The distillery is also where Diageo bottles most of its orphan barrel whiskeys, and there's a new release in that range as well. Muckety Muck is a 24-year-old single-grain Scotch whiskey from the closed Port Dundas distillery and gets its name from one of the prize-winning pigs raised at the distillery. It'll be available in limited quantities with a recommended retail price of around $225 a bottle. And speaking of pigs, Whistle Pig Rye has released the 7th edition in its Boss Hog series. Magellan's Atlantic is Whistle Pig's first double cask finish release. It spent the first 17 years in ex-bourbon barrels before being finished in Spanish oak. But Whistle Pig CEO Jeff Kozak says his blending team decided the whiskey needed something else, something that has rarely, if ever, been used before.
We ended up then taking the next step and going into South American teakwood, which I agree with you is not really ever been attempted or trialed. And that use of the teakwood, it just comes from our constant exploration under our Old World series, where we're always trying to see what would potentially be the next Boss Hog cask. So for us, it was the first double finish, right, starting in Spanish oak and then going to South American teakwood. And, I think the teakwood was an extremely short finish. It was only about 2 to 3 days, right? And that's what gave it all the vanilla notes and the cinnamon and the allspice, which again kind of matched, just perfectly with what happened with the Spanish oak. And remember, we're starting with an old 17-year-old straight rye whiskey, right? So again, typically nothing that is ever done at that age. Again,
is that additive, right? It might be adding a little bit of complexity, but with the 2 finishes, I think we really nailed it this year.
The casks also play into the name and story behind Magellan's Atlantic, which celebrates the 500th anniversary of Magellan's first ever voyage around the world between 1519 and 1522. That brings up a new set of questions, given that Magellan and his crew clashed with indigenous peoples regularly in South America and Asia during that expedition. In fact, Magellan himself was killed in one of those battles in 1521 in what is now the Philippines. And Mortimer, one of Whistle Pig's mascots, appears on the stopper of Boss Hog 7th edition, dressed in what appears to be Spanish bullfighting regalia. I asked Jeff Kozak to address the potential for what some might see as culturally insensitive, both in an email ahead of our interview and again during the interview.
I think when we chose Magellan, we were looking for somebody that epitomizes how we try to make whiskey. And, we're always looking for that new space, that new place of exploration, right? And so here was a guy that, eventually his efforts resulted in the first circumnavigation, right, of the earth. And again, I think that's when we try to tell a story, when we try to put out a new whiskey in new barrels, again, it's that spirit of exploration. And that's what Magellan was, epitomizing, and I think of all the other space shuttles and Challengers and, other people use explorers in their names just to basically, again, give us something to reach for. And again, that's what this Boss Hog was trying to do, give somebody a sense of what whiskey and rye whiskey could be if you reach a little further than anybody else out there.
Can you understand why some people might be offended by this, given that with the issues in the United States over Confederate monuments being taken down and being protested, we've also seen in Florida and the Southwest and Arizona, California, statues of Spanish conquistadors being taken down or being protested. And the fact that we're getting ready, this Monday is Columbus Day to a lot of people, but it's also to many others being celebrated now as Indigenous Peoples Day. Can you understand why there might be some cultural sensitivity here?
Yeah, again, anytime you go back into time and pick a historical figure, I think there's always going to be that potential. Again, I look at it and say we're a whiskey company that's also trying to be a storyteller. I still think we'll try to, again, pick appropriate people that are either historical because, again, I think it'll convey something more. Magellan and his quest conveys more than, describing a whiskey as a double would. So I understand your point. I think, again, we're just always trying to at least become a whiskey maker that is conscious of what's happening, be able to tell a great story, but first and foremost, put out great whiskey.
Kozak said Magellan's story will continue with the next Boss Hog release, and it will address Magellan's death in the Philippines. This year's Boss Hog 7th edition will be available at first in the U.S. and then in select international markets. The recommended retail price is around $500 a bottle. I received a sample of it, and I'll have my tasting notes for it later in the show. Lots of other new whiskeys unveiled this week, including a rarity from Ireland. English Whisky Company is releasing Black Pits, a triple-distilled peated Irish single malt. It's the second release of Teeling's own whiskey from its distillery in Dublin, and uses both ex-bourbon and Sauterne wine casks for the maturation. It's a bit of a throwback to the days when the Teeling family ran Cooley Distillery and introduced the peated Connemara Irish whiskey. But, as Jack Teeling told me this week, there's an even deeper tradition behind it.
It was a whole opportunity to present, a true diverse category of Irish single malt and the peated end, because it has a lot of provenance and heritage that is forgotten about or hasn't been written about in Ireland, that, we wanted to do something interesting and different. And our Black Pit is very different.
Teeling Black Pits is available in Ireland now and soon in Europe and Asia, as well as the U.S., where it'll sell for around $75 a bottle. And Knock has released its second batch of Peat Heart, its heavily peated Highland single malt. Batch 2 was initially released in Sweden, but will now be available globally except for the U.S. It'll carry a recommended retail price of £52 a bottle in the UK. Nika has introduced Nika Tailored. It's a blend of malts from Nika's Yoichi and Miyagikyo distilleries, along with coffee still grain whiskey produced at Miyagikyo. It's available in the UK and select global markets for around £110 a bottle. The Glenallachie has introduced a new limited edition range of 12-year-old single malts. The Virgin Oak series includes whiskeys finished in French Virgin Oak, Spanish Virgin Oak, and Chinkapin Virgin Oak from the U.S. They'll be available in the UK for around £60 each. The Balvenie has unveiled batch number 7 of Maltmaster David Stewart's Ton 1509 single malts. He created this batch from 21 different casks that were blended and left to marry in the vatting tun for 3 whole months before bottling. It'll sell for around $410 a bottle in the U.S., no word yet on pricing elsewhere. The Glenrothes is out with its oldest whiskey release on record, a 50-year-old single malt created by the distillery's new master whiskey maker, Laura Rampling. She's taking over for Gordon Motion within the Edrington family at the Glenrothes. Gordon is still making Highland Park, though. Only 50 bottles of the Glenrothes 50-year-old will be available worldwide. There is no word on the pricing, but it does include an exclusive experience at the distillery and the Glenrothes estate nearby. In much wider supply, but not by all that much, Buffalo Trace and the Van Winkle family have unveiled this year's Van Winkle whiskeys. The 20 and 23-year-old Pappy Van Winkle bourbons will be in even shorter supply than usual this year because the Angels took more than their share from the barrels. The 10, 12, and 15-year-old bourbons will be just about as available this year as in the past, while the 13-year-old rye should be in wider supply. Now, Buffalo Trace and the Van Winkles have issued their annual call against buying on the secondary market, largely because it's illegal. But they've gone a step farther this year when it comes to retailers who charge well above recommended retail prices. While they have no control over what individual retailers charge for a bottle of Pappy, they are asking consumers to report retailers who try to mark up prices to your state attorney general's office. Most states have a consumer protection division within the AG's office. You can keep up with the latest whiskey news all week long at WhiskyCast.com. Time now for the WhiskyCast calendar of events brought to you by Catoctin Creek Distilling. First of all, it's now official. The remaining Whiskey Live events in Australia for 2020 have now been postponed until 2021. That affects Whiskey Live in Sydney October 30th and 31st, and in Perth on November 20th and 21st. The virtual version of the Kentucky Bourbon Festival kicks off this Thursday online and runs through next Sunday. And we'll hear about the inaugural virtual English Whisky Festival this coming weekend in a few minutes. The Taipei Whiskey Club has a tasting October 21st in Taipei, Taiwan. The Spirit of Toronto Festival's series of online tastings gets underway October 23rd with Hiram Walker Distillery's Don Livermore, and on the 24th with Stephanie McLeod of Dewars and Aberfeldy. The Whiskey Obsession Festival takes place November 4th at the Armature Works in Tampa, Florida, and McTeers has its next whiskey auction November 6th in Glasgow, Scotland. We're updating the calendar at WhiskyCast.com throughout the week as we get updates on postponements and new dates for 2021 events. The calendar of events is brought to you by Catoctin Creek Distilling, makers of Virginia's most awarded spirits. You'll find their Roundstone Rye at fine whiskey shops in 26 U.S. states, 3 continents, and online, too. Visit the Where to Buy page at CatoctinCreekDistilling.com to find a retailer near you. And please drink responsibly.
Hey, what's up, everybody? It's Gabriel Cardarella again, the Doers Guy. I've seen a lot in my years as a brand ambassador for the world's most awarded blended scotch. Like the time I got to taste a bottle from 1905. That's right. I got to enjoy a bottle of scotch that was manufactured before the Titanic. Pretty cool, right? Well, here's another story for you. In 2019, our master blender, Stephanie McLeod, became the first woman to be awarded Master Blender of the Year by the International Whisky Competition. And a year after that, she won it again. Stephanie's first creation for Dewar's 15 year, is another piece of history. Sweet, floral, with notes of honey and toffee, a perfectly balanced addition to the Dewar's lineup. It's a great introduction to scotch for beginners, and it's more than complex enough to satisfy whiskey aficionados. So grab some Dewar's 15, call some friends, and make a few stories of your own. That's what a good bottle of whiskey is all about.
WhiskyCast In Depth is brought to you by Mortlock. A month from now, we'll be celebrating the 15th anniversary of WhiskyCast. And this week, we are doing something that we have never done in all that time. It's part of our long-term plan to build an even bigger tent to bring more whiskey enthusiasts together. A tent that will continue to embrace diversity and unique voices to share even more stories, more conversation, and more whiskey fellowship, while remaining true to our mission statement, and that is this. WhiskyCast strives to generate the most relevant and innovative cask-strength content and conversation by sharing the story of whiskey with ethical and passionate distinction. So, starting with this episode, you'll be hearing some new voices on WhiskyCast from time to time, and in a few months you'll be seeing some new ways to discover the world of whiskey with WhiskyCast, all with a goal of bringing you closer to the spirit and helping you grow your passion for whiskey. In an average week, we spend about 30 hours producing just the editorial content for this podcast. During an intense whiskey work week, that can jump to 50 hours. Now, I am not complaining. I have the best job in the world, and I am not going anywhere anytime soon. Over the years, I've had the privilege of meeting many of you to share drams and stories, and those interactions are what fuel our passion around here. Knowing that WhiskyCast adds value to your whiskey knowledge, your drams, and your week, well, that's important to us.
The one thing we hear all the time is that you'd like more of WhiskyCast. And in order to do that, we're starting to grow just a bit. One of our longtime listeners, Chris Ratcliff from the UK, is impressively whiskey curious. You may have heard him on some of our webcasts asking questions over the last couple of months, and we decided that it was worth talking to Chris in more detail, and we'd like you to meet him. Chris is joining me now from his home near London. And Chris, let's first of all talk about how you got into whiskey in the first place.
So I have to say, growing up, I had no interest in whiskey. There was no family interest in whiskey. I started drinking Jack Daniels. It's just widely available, and I would drink Jack Daniels and Coke, and that was my drink, and I had no real interest in whiskey. And then one day, a friend gave me Jim Beam Black Label and said, "Here, try this." And I was like, yeah, okay, it's all the same stuff. It's all bourbon. Yes, I know Jack Daniels isn't a bourbon. And I went, hang on, there's something in this. This is quantifiably different. There's something that exists in one that doesn't exist in the other. There are different flavors. There is depth. There is a lightness to the Jim Beam that isn't there in the Jack Daniels. And I went, if there's a difference between these two, well, what about all the others? So I started an interest in it. I started trying different whiskies, and the one that really sticks with me, and the one where I probably had my kind of road to Damascus moment was shortly after that. I went to a Burns Night dinner and tasting in town, and I had Lefroy Quarter Cask, which, if you are new to whiskey, Lefroy Quarter Cask is quite the mind-bending experience.
Yeah.
And this is probably slightly gross, and I probably shouldn't say it, but I'm going to anyway. I went home. I've still got the program from that tasting, and I went home that night and I thought about it. And the following morning, I was going into work, and I burped, and I could still taste the smoke, and I could still taste that iodine TCP sort of flavour. And it just kicked everything in my head again. And from there, it was just like, you know, I got Jura Superstition, and I started tasting different stuff in bars. And the more I learned, it wasn't just whiskey. You know, whiskey isn't just a thing. There are differences. The people are different. The distilleries are different. The regions are different. Even, different countries. So American whiskey versus Scottish whiskey versus Irish whiskey. And it's just this rabbit hole that I've been sort of going down ever since for about the last sort of 12 years or so.
Gee, that sounds familiar because it's pretty much the same way I got into whiskey without the burping. And that's one of the reasons why we wanted to have you start out as one of our first contributors, is because you still have this curiosity and desire to learn more that really was sort of what got me started 15 years ago with WhiskyCast, because I started so that I could learn more. And over the years, I've gotten to the point where I know a lot about whiskey, but I still don't know everything, and I'm learning more all the time. But part of me thinks that I'm losing some of the innate curiosity because I've been able to pick up so much. And that's where I want you to come in with your own curiosity, because you're still learning on your journey in whiskey. And I think that's where we can make this work, is with you on your journey and being able to tell the stories in the way that we've started years ago on WhiskyCast, and doing it with independence and journalistic ethics and doing it the right way. And I know that you will do it that way, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think one of the things that really sparked this off for me, this whole desire to communicate about whiskey, was telling friends stories. So I had one group of friends who were talking about Japanese whiskey, and I went, hey, do you know why they're cutting Hibiki 12? And do you know about the shortages and the senior management who now can't drink it because the stocks are so low, or they're not allowed to drink it? And then you start getting to these other stories where you sort of go, well, you know, people like will run through department stores to try and grab a bottle, or they'll buy miniatures, and people are just absolutely fascinated. The same with Shackleton's whiskey. The idea of going and getting the whiskey and drawing a sample and having to put it back and preserve it. And you talk to people and you tell people these stories, and it's got nothing to do necessarily with the flavor or with, you know, hints of vanilla and caramel and all this sort of stuff. But they're drawn into the whiskey. They love the stories. And I want to find more of those. And I want to tell stories that not only are interesting and are fun and are maybe sometimes frivolous, or they may be rooted in some really serious things like we've seen recently with Young Corneris Distillery, but stories that have a basis, they have a depth to them, they have an integrity that I can tell somebody in all good knowledge that what I'm telling them is true, and it's you know, it's just aside, you know, it's apart from the whiskey marketing that you read on the back of a bottle. It's something that exists, and it's something that enhances people's knowledge and enjoyment of whiskey, because they know more than just what colour the bottle is and which part of the world it's made in.
So let's talk about this first story that you've produced on the English whiskey scene.
So this was an interesting one because I've been to a number of English whisky distilleries. English whisky doesn't sell itself brilliantly. It sits really in the shadow of the whisky that's produced in the rest of the United Kingdom and Great Britain, for that matter. And getting into it, you think, this product is actually really good. And there are so many people making it. And we've had, the English wine industry has had this problem for years where we produce great English wine, but people will still walk past it in the supermarket and they'll get something French or they'll get something from South Africa because they don't think that English wine is as good as French wine. And it's the same with English whiskey, that you look and you go, well, you could buy a Scottish whiskey, you could buy an Irish whiskey. They're the proper whiskies, really, aren't they? And you kind of go, no! We've got people up and down the country now who are producing interesting, different whiskies because nobody knows what they should be producing. So I think it's really exciting to find an industry that is trying to find its feet and is trying to get out of this shadow and actually put their flag in the ground and go, you know what? Our stuff is just as good as everybody else's, sometimes maybe even better. Come, try it. Try our new make, try our aging spirit. Come with us. Let's see what this can be.
And let's listen to the story now.
English whisky isn't new. There were several distilleries around England producing both malt and grain whiskies in the late 1800s, as catalogued in Alfred Barnard's book, The Whisky Distilleries of the United Kingdom, in 1887. However, these were all closed by 1905, and whisky production left England until 2006, when the English Whisky Company distilled their first new make spirit at the St George Distillery. Since then, the boom in whisky has seen many more whisky distilleries pop up around England, and now the English Whisky Society is running a virtual festival on October 16th and 17th, featuring 13 English whisky distilleries, something impossible only a few years ago. I caught up with English Whisky Society founder Richard Foster via Zoom to find out more.
I moved to Sydenham in South London 2 years ago, and at the same time there was a tap room on the high street called Ignition Brewery that opened up. Now, Ignition is a not-for-profit. They're a fantastic little social enterprise who employ staff with learning disabilities, and they wanted events, and so someone had nabbed the quiz already, and I thought, well, this whiskey stuff's fun. Why don't I run some whiskey tastings? English whiskey came into my life through kind of themed nights where we're doing like Six Nations rugby tastings. So, you know, I'd go out and find a bottle from each country, and English whiskey piqued my interest, but there was no real kind of centre or hub or point of information for the English whiskey scene. So did a bit of research, did a bit of ferreting around myself. Cooper King have had this map, which is really a really useful resource that's been around for a few years now, that they keep updating with the latest English distilleries that are in the game. Yeah, that was where the inspiration came from to start the English Whisky Society.
And what has the response been to that so far?
The idea kind of came to me at the end of 2019, and at the beginning of this year, I had grand plans, as I'm sure many people did at the beginning of 2020. COVID struck, and I thought all those plans are out the window. But then speaking with various distilleries, they were quite keen to do something and keep the momentum going. So we did a big tasting on St George's Day for about 50 people online. And although it was quite an undertaking, we had to hand bottle and write labels for 8 whiskies for 50 people. So about sort of 400 samples and ship them out. So it was a big task, but it was brilliant. It was great fun. And the thing that made it was the feedback, both from people taking part and the distilleries, who were just like, right, what's next? And so what's next was the festival.
Going from that to a 2-day festival with 6 or 7 sessions, that's quite a jump. You've got, 13 distilleries on board as well?
Yeah, we've got liquid from 14, but we've got 13 distilleries taking part. For us, it's huge. And for most of the English distilleries, it's huge as well. For many of them, it's the first time they'll have actually talked about their whiskey or talked about whiskey in a forum that is bigger than just things they've organised locally to themselves. But hopefully it will be a really interesting and really fun experience for both the distilleries and obviously all of the attendees who are coming to participate.
What's the split like with attendees? Are a lot of these people English whisky aficionados, or are there people who are just curious, who've maybe done one tasting before and just want to find out more?
There's obviously a niche who are really into English whisky and follow it, and whether they follow a particular distillery or the scene in general as it is becoming a bigger category. But yeah, we've got people coming who are just interested in whiskey or have maybe done online tastings during lockdown and realised that actually they're quite fun, they're quite accessible, and maybe a bit less intimidating than going into a bar or whiskey lounge and having to pretend to be something you're not when actually you just want to experience whiskey for the first time.
You mentioned the English whisky scene. Can you give us a picture really of what the scene is at the moment and how it's expanding and what it's becoming really? One thing that I often forget, and I think people when they talk about English whisky forget, is that this is a scene that is really about 15 years old. And actually 15 years ago, there were very few players in the market. So really the distilleries that are active now have really become active in the last 6 years, except for a couple, sort of English Whisky Company being kind of the oldest, most long-standing of the modern English whisky distilleries. But really the kind of last 6 to 10 years has seen the real explosion, the real rise in English whisky. But the entire volume of English whisky equates to a sort of medium to large single Scotch distillery. So this is a very different, this is not comparable to Scotch in any way, shape or form at the moment. I'd say that the closest would be maybe looking at some of the new distilleries that are opening in Scotland, some of the smaller, more kind of craft, small batch distilleries. That's kind of where English whisky is at. But it makes it, for me, very interesting because it's about the ingredients, it's about the locality, it's about the people, it's about the kind of, Yorkshire distilleries are very proud to be Yorkshire, in a way that Scotch whisky is often proud to be Scottish. Here it's more, I guess, regional in terms of county or in terms of the West Country for Dartmoor and Hicks and Healy's. So it's a very different scene, and it's one that's driven by a desire to create either very high quality or very interesting, or both, spirits. And it's very unique. Every distillery is doing something different, and that's what I love about it. If somebody is coming to English whisky, they've never tasted one before, which ones would you recommend to people to show them what English whisky can be? Well, obviously, as the English Whisky Society, we don't have any favourites. They're all our favourites. I'm sipping on a Dartmoor because my wife just made a tartan, and it was just the perfect accompaniment. Very light, very fruity, and I have a particular affinity to Dartmoor because I have family down in Devon. There's a lot of very accessible whiskey, Dartmoor, Spirit of Yorkshire, English Whisky Company, Cotswolds, Original, all of those sort of standard releases are, if you're looking to try something for the first time, you definitely can't go wrong trying any of the distilleries' sort of standard releases. But then there's also really interesting things happening, like Oxford Artisan have got their rye whiskey, which is obviously a very different flavour profile, perhaps not something you expect from an English distillery, but it's fantastic, both mixed in cocktails or drunk neat. And then you've got distilleries playing around with peating their new make and sort of adding that layer of smokiness and flavour. So White Peak haven't even released whiskey yet, but the aged spirit that they have put to market has had a very a very rapturous reception. There's great things happening all across the board, really. Is there anything coming up either in terms of distilleries or in whiskies that are kind of in the works that you're quite excited about? So Copper Rivet will be releasing their first Mast House single malt whiskey just after the festival. I'm very, very excited to try that, partly because they claim or their ambition is to create the best whiskey in the world. If someone's putting that out there as their purpose with creating whiskey, then it's not one you're going to turn down at the first opportunity to try it. But, there's also Cooper King up in Yorkshire have laid down their first new make, and their new make's actually won awards in its own right. So even though their whiskey won't be of age for another couple of years, there's products you can try that allow you to experience the journey, I guess, as well, that distillery is going on in a way that perhaps with Scotch, that journey happened a long time ago, and you can't be part of that kind of that excitement. It is a roller coaster because you just don't know exactly what's going to come at each step of the process. So to be able to go on that journey with the distilleries is something that also makes English whisky very unique and exciting at the moment. Now, English whisky has obviously been overshadowed somewhat by both Scottish whisky, Irish whisky, also Welsh whisky with Penderyn. What can the English whisky industry do to come out of that shadow and to become more prominent, do you think?
I think it already has. I mean, you've got, Bimber releasing bottles that are snapped up in hours. You've got, as I said, White Peak, releasing aging spirit that isn't even whiskey yet and getting very high scores and great awards. I guess it rests individually on the distilleries at the moment, and maybe the next phase, the next chapter of English whisky history is how they come together and define that combined purpose. There's no rules yet for English whisky. There is no definition like with Scotch. And that may come. I'm sure it will. I'm sure there will be a kind of an agreement between the distilleries to create some rules, hopefully not too stringent ones, but some guiding principles as to what English whisky should be to be able to be called that. Right now, it's kind of like the Wild West in a way, and everyone's doing it their own way. And it's very collaborative. I know that a lot of the distilleries and distillers and their teams know each other, work with each other. And I know there have been conversations, the distilleries are talking to each other, and there are various conversations around what the future looks like. And I think that collaboration will be key, really, because if you look at Wales, obviously Penderyn is amazing and there are new distilleries opening, but it's a very small market. Whereas England is in quite a strong position in that while we're a long, long way behind, we're sort of 10% of the number of distilleries, totally in Scotland, in England currently. But there is, I guess, the breadth and depth of possibility in England. This map that Cooper King keep trying to update, they just can't do it quick enough. Like everyone who's got a still is pretty much playing around with whiskey production. And so I think we're at sort of 26 at the moment, although I hear talk of new ones, all the time, where I come across someone that I thought was just producing gin, vodka and rum, and suddenly you see that they've got their first, whiskey or new make released. So yeah, it's a really exciting time. And I think if there was a shadow over English whisky, it has definitely moved off somewhere else. Because right now I think, English whisky is very of the moment. It's very topical. And as we are, everyone is talking about it and wants to know more.
While distilleries are reopening now and virtual events in full swing, back in mid-March the UK government announced a COVID-19 lockdown, and with that, bars, distilleries and retail whisky stores all shut their doors. In the last 6 months, though, the restrictions have been eased in the UK, allowing visitors and patrons to return in search of whisky, albeit with some restrictions. However, with UK COVID-19 cases rising, the rule of 6 has been introduced in England, meaning no gatherings of more than 6 people from different households. And while England has limited gatherings, Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland all set their own COVID-19 regulations and hence have different limits on people gathering and when businesses can open. This has meant the whisky industry across England has had to adapt to these new challenges and find new ways to keep the doors open and the lights on. While making, blending and bottling whisky has largely continued, it's those businesses who rely on customers through the door and drinking whisky that have been heaviest hit. With events being cancelled and bars limiting their capacity, I spoke with Amy Seaton, owner of the Birmingham Whisky Club, on Zoom to discuss how life has changed for the whisky bar.
We're back open. We're still not seeing the footfall that we would have done, because we normally have a fairly busy summer, which is always quite strange to me. Seeing, I always worry about the summer period because it's not really a traditionally kind of whiskey drinking time. But obviously, if you're a hardened whiskey drinker, then every day is a whiskey day, really. So we've been open for nearly 3 years now. We're very much an events-led space as much as anything. So we have huge amounts of events going on all the time and lots of group events. And we were able to do, so in July, we were able to do a couple of virtual tastings. But then what I realised that every single other club was doing the same virtual tastings as us. And that's been a really interesting kind of learning curve. Because obviously before, it would be in the tasting room at the back, and it wouldn't matter if, you guys were doing exactly the same tasting the week later because we're all taking from very, very distinct pools. But now everything's online. Anyone can do any tasting. So that was a bit of a rude awakening. And not in a bad way. I've realised how many clubs, how many organisations that do virtual tastings. It's been great in a way because you get a real sense of who's out there, which is fab. But we did a few, and then we just started kind of thinking about products and what else we could sell, basically, when we were all back. And we picked up a website project that we've been working on. So we now have a very fancy new website and lots of lovely products. but it is a complete change in business model, I guess, because we can't now just count on being a bar and an event space. So that's kind of where we are. It feels like sort of March was just yesterday and then also years ago in the same kind of, in the same breath.
With British pubs facing new social distancing requirements that can change from day to day, that's forced Amy Seaton to change the way she does business.
In a way, it's fine because we can space people out quite naturally. And also because we're Birmingham, we're now on, we're on the naughty step, obviously, over the last few weeks. So I don't know. I assume we will have a curfew at some point. So I think the impact is, I would say, on staff, I think, massively, and how we have to just deal with updates to news, and we kind of make assumptions. You can't plan, and anyone who has owned their own business knows it's all about long-term planning, but then also kind of dealing with things as they come in. Hours have been hugely reduced. Our capacity is less than half, but it's our events that have really suffered. So we were a place for stag do's, which always sounds like, they're actually, lovely, lovely groups. And they always start with an email saying, we're a large group of lads coming into Birmingham. It's like, stag do, it's okay, you can say it. We've had some great groups of guys, and they all want a bit of kind of education before they go off and get absolutely trolleyed on Broad Street. But yeah, so they can't book. So I'm hoping next year will be a kind of bumper year for weddings and stag do's, and we'll do okay. But the rule of 6 that we're all talking about in the UK, at least, we've kind of adhered to it anyway, but it does impact. August was traditionally a very good month for things, but it's been quite sad actually to kind of see. But having said that, the customers have been brilliant. We haven't had any kind of trouble. Now I've said that, I probably will this weekend. Very few cancelled bookings, which is lovely, because I know a lot of my friends who are also bar owners in Birmingham have had big cancellations, and restaurants as well. That's, been really awful. We've had a few here and there, but we've always done deposits, and it's really lovely because I think people are really taking it seriously. And this idea of supporting independence has become extremely important to people.
As a second lockdown is being talked about, what would that mean for the whiskey bar?
I think what we would do if we had to close the bar again, we would rely on our online stock now. So we've now, got to a really good level. We've used the government money, basically to support, stock levels and turn them into kind of things that tasting experiences that people can have at home. And we'll do a few online tastings, but it kind of mainly depends on the government support again. There's a lot of pressure from the industry. There's a lot of advocates who want the furlough scheme extended, because our furlough scheme over in the UK ends at the end of October, and it's not even a full kind of furlough. So if you've got staff like mine, where we're back part-time, that has been absolutely critical for us to be able to come back to work and do the bits that we can, but not on a full-time basis. To be honest, it depends entirely on government support, but we are going into Christmas as well. So we always do very well with gifts and what have you at Christmas time. So I don't know, it's a bit of a fingers crossed. I'll be here to say the same next year.
For the distilleries who rely on tourism, travel restrictions to foreign countries and the possibilities of quarantine have led many in the UK to spend their holiday travelling to beauty spots like the Lake District in the northeast of England. I spoke with Kirsty Taylor from the Lakes Distillery near Keswick via Zoom on what the travel boom has meant for them.
The single biggest impact is our visitor numbers have literally halved. What we've seen, despite our visitor numbers on each tour halving, guests are getting a more personal experience. Our guests also seem to be much more responsive to be having much more in-depth experiences. So rather than the sort of standard classic hour-long tour, we've seen significant uplift in interest in our sort of more in-depth single malt whiskey tours. We do a malt and chocolate pairing tour. We're getting more and more interest in the more detailed and in-depth experiences than just the standard sort of 1 hour tour, which is sort of an introduction to the whiskey making philosophy at the Lakes. The distillery itself kept working in the sense of the whiskey making team was still based there. And they still kept going with production, but obviously on a very limited team and on very different working practices. That being said, the site itself is used to having probably in excess of 250 guests walking through the doors a day. So it's a radical change to atmosphere, ambience, the whole environment for that team by literally having locked gates. From a brand perspective, tricky because the winter months in the Lake District is our very quiet period. And really the end of March and the lead up to Easter is really where the gates to the national park sort of theoretically open, and Easter is always an incredibly busy weekend for us. And then all the way through really to November is incredibly busy. So to not have any guests coming through the doors for the busiest period in April, May, June and July is very, very strange, very strange. And from a brand perspective, sad because it's a real missed opportunity, because the distillery experience is really the best opportunity that we have to really allow the consumer to not only taste our liquid, but to also see it, breathe it, smell it. You know, we can educate and they can experience the brand on every sensory aspect. And yeah, to miss the 4 busiest months of the year is sad.
So what actually has changed from a visitor point of view at the distillery? What have you had to put in place?
We now have almost like a sort of concierge service. So when you arrive at the distillery, there's someone at the gate to meet you. You know, we temperature check every guest that comes on site. We give them a personal explanation of the practices that we're working to. If they're coming for a tour, we sort of tell them where they need to go and wait and check in. And just having that one-on-one conversation at the point at which our guests enter the distillery. The biggest single change that we've noticed this year is the influx of visitors, especially from the south of England, into the Lake District National Park.
This is still the start of a new story for English whisky. And while the pandemic is causing people to put their plans on hold and businesses under pressure, there is optimism for the English whisky industry if it can get through COVID okay. For WhiskyCast, I'm Chris Ratcliff.
So what did you learn from all this, Chris?
I was really shocked about how many English whisky distilleries there actually are. I could probably name on both hands a number, and I thought that was the majority of it. I discovered, to my slight embarrassment, that there's actually a distillery 31 miles away from my house, which I'd heard the name of, but I never knew it was so close. I found mash bills that I never knew were being produced in Britain. I found tastings and festivals and memberships and kits that open up a whole new world. So I think if people want to discover more about English whisky and they want to really see the young industry finding its feet, experimenting, trying things, now's the time to do it, because it's really page 1 of the English whisky story. And from here, hopefully, fingers crossed, we could see an explosion to match any other whisky region.
Well, you have done well, young Padawan. Go forth and report some more now.
Thank you, Mark. I will gladly go and do so.
As we go forward, we're counting on you to be part of the journey with us. We want your ideas for stories you'd like us to cover, and we'll be adding correspondents in other parts of the world with a special emphasis on diversity as well as curiosity. We're open to suggestions along those lines as well. That's WhiskyCast in Depth, brought to you by Mortlock, whiskey's best-kept secret. Hidden away for decades in some of the world's most famous Scotch whiskies comes a single malt inspired by an original for a fortunate few. Discover the entire Mortlock lineup at malts.com. The Bottom Tasting This Week department is brought to you by Sagamore Spirit. Let's start off with the Whistle Pig Rye Boss Hog 7th edition I mentioned during the news. Magellan's Atlantic has that short finishing time in South American teakwood casks, along with the longer finishing time in Spanish oak. It'll vary in strength to around 52 or 53% ABV, depending on the bottling. The nose has notes of sandalwood, tropical fruits, toasted coconut, baking spices, marzipan, cooked banana, vanilla cream, and just a hint of dried flowers. The taste is rich and equally complex with baking spices, red apples, sandalwood, cooked banana, dried flowers, a hint of maple syrup, and touches of oak tannins and toasted coconut. The finish is long with lingering spices, balanced by hints of tropical fruits, toasted coconut, and oak tannins. It is a very unusual rye whiskey, but packs a lot of flavor into the glass. I'm scoring the Whistle Pig Rye Boss Hog 7th Edition, Magellan's Atlantic, a 94. Woodford Reserve's Baccarat Edition is probably one of the most expensive bourbons ever made, with a list price at $2,000 a bottle. It's made with the standard Woodford Reserve recipe and maturation, followed by an extra 3 years of time in XO cognac casks imported from France. And it's bottled at 45.2% ABV. The nose has notes of dark fruits, cocoa beans, a nice oakiness, and freshly ground vanilla beans, along with subtle spices. The taste has dried fruits complemented by hints of clove, cinnamon, and allspice, along with dark chocolate, toasted caramel, vanilla, and a subtle oakiness in the background. The finish has subtle spices that linger nicely, along with touches of baking chocolate, caramel, and a hint of fruity character. This is a well-rounded and complex bourbon. I'm scoring the Woodford Reserve Baccarat Edition a 95. I'll have more tasting notes in just a minute, but first, our tasting notes are brought to you each week by Sagamore Spirit Rye Whiskey, which will be releasing the next batch of Penny's Proof very soon. It's a preview of Sagamore Spirit Whiskey distilled on-site in Baltimore. Last year's first release of samples sold out in hours. The only way to find out when and how to get your hands on this year's batch is to join Sagamore Spirit's Whiskey Thieves. Sign up today at sagamorespirit.com. Next up, let's look at the first single-barrel release from Milam and Green in Texas. It's a 4-year-old single-barrel bourbon distilled in Tennessee and bottled at 43% ABV. The nose has notes of honey, caramel, vanilla, and hints of peaches and butterscotch. The taste is sweet and fruity, with a nice underlying spiciness and touches of peaches, red apples, and apricots to go along with the black pepper and cinnamon spices underneath. The finish is long and well-balanced with a nice spiciness, and I'm scoring the Milam and Green single-barrel bourbon a 92. Finally, I received a sample this week of Stranahan's Mountain Angel. It's a 10-year-old American single malt that is the oldest whiskey ever released by Stranahan's in Denver, and it's bottled at 47.3% ABV. The nose is oaky with a darkness that reminds me of a leather football left out in the rain, along with touches of caramel apples, cherry pipe tobacco, and a hint of cocoa beans. The taste is thick and rich with subtle spices, dark chocolate, molasses cookies, and a nice oakiness. The finish is long and woody with touches of molasses and dark chocolate, along with a hint of chocolate mint leaves. I'm scoring the Stranahan's Mountain Angel a 93. The What I'm Tasting This Week department is brought to you by Sagamore Spirit. I'll be adding these tasting notes to our searchable list of more than 2,900 different whiskeys from all over the world. Check it out this week at WhiskyCast.com.
The search never ends, but it's nice when you can come in for a landing, pause and explore the silky smoothness of single pot still Irish whiskey, matured in the finest bourbon and Oloroso sherry casks. Land on Redbreast, then be sure to pass it on. Proud sponsor of WhiskyCast.
Let's open up the inbox now for your voice. Had a lot of comments on last week's episode with our panel from The Whiskey Show on diversity and inclusion in the whiskey world, along with our live webcast following that panel that expanded on the topic. Odysseus Unbound posted this on Instagram. Mark, this was one of the most interesting WhiskyCast in-depth segments ever, and there have been some really great ones. Kudos to you for standing up for what's right. Inclusivity equals more people getting creative input, equals more ideas, equals more choice for whiskey drinkers. Everybody wins. And at Jigs Alonzo added this on Instagram from the Philippines. I just saw your webcast with Becky, Felipe, and Jenna earlier today. I absolutely can't wait to hear all the insights from this panel, Mark. It's been challenging getting people, especially consumers in the Philippines, to recognize the need for true inclusivity or to even consider discussing these issues. I'm hopeful, though, that discussions like this will help shed light on possible ways to move forward, especially when it comes to the creation of policies that can champion the right values. And Sam Sneed sent this note from Auckland, New Zealand. The good news is, in the last 10 years or so, there has definitely been large strides made on this front. At the big shows and at many of my seminars and tastings, I have seen the changes. It's nice to see, and it appears to be happening at an accelerated rate. The more the merrier, I say. Thanks to all of you for those comments. Now on Friday night's Happy Hour webcast, Carla Carlton of Bourbon Plus magazine, Nino Marchetti of The Whiskey Wash, and Chris Ratcliff joined me. One of the things we discussed was this year's Pappy Van Winkle releases. And for the record, I was the one who said they were good whiskeys, but not worth all of the hype and overinflated pricing. Sue Williams at Real Sue Williams on Twitter shared this comment. Another fun episode. Thank you. I do appreciate the consensus that Pappy 23 isn't that great. That's the one good thing about bar closures, not having to listen to some guy tell me I should be drinking Pappy. And she added an eye-rolling emoji. Okay, gang, don't put down another person's whiskey choices, period. That's just not cool. If you have a question, a suggestion, or anything else you'd like to share with whiskey lovers around the world, you can always find us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at WhiskyCast. The email address is comments@whiskycast.com. Let's close out the show now with Behind the Label, our look at the history, science, and other things that make whiskey unique. It's brought to you by Writer's Tears. Booker Noe was one of the bourbon industry's giants in influence as well as in stature. He was the master distiller for Jim Beam from 1965 until he officially retired in 1992, but he still kept going out on the road to promote Jim Beam until shortly before his death in 2004. His influence is still felt to this day. For instance, he gets a lot of the credit for creating the concept of small batch whiskeys, including the Booker's bourbon that carries his name. When you get a chance to talk to people who worked with him and for him, all you have to do is mention Booker, and the stories start to flow. Marlene Holmes is the master distiller for Milam and Green in Austin, Texas, but she got her start working for Booker Noe at Jim Beam. The other night, she and her colleagues were doing a virtual tasting with whiskey writers when I asked her to share her best Booker Noe story.
Back in 1990, I was self-employed. I was doing some remodeling, and I had a small farm there in Kentucky, had a small lake on that farm. Well, tobacco was a big product that you could grow, there in Kentucky for revenue on your property. And that was starting to phase out. So something that was starting to phase in was raising catfish. So I went to the county extension office there in the county I lived in, and the guy told me, he said, Booker Noe, and I didn't know at the time who Booker Noe was, is experimenting or wants to experiment with the spent stillage. The distiller's grain, it was already selling it as livestock feed, so he was wanting to experiment and see if it could be used for fish food. And so, I thought, I would like to raise some catfish, and Booker sounds like, he's wanting to get into that line as far as, getting rid of the distiller's grain. So I met Booker, and we chatted. So he bought 1,000 catfish fingerlings. He had the maintenance guys make this huge cage. They dropped it in a lake there on the property, and so they needed somebody to feed the fish. So I was the fish feeder. That's how I actually got into the distillery business, and it was a lot of fun. I would go down there in the afternoons, and the guys would have a grill sitting out behind the shop or the dryer house, and they'd be grilling steaks or chicken or, cooking rabbit or turtle or what have you. And I thought, man, this just seems like a really neat business to get into. It was just so laid back, and so a job was available, and I applied, and I got that job and started on third shift as a distillery operator. So needless to say, the fish experiment with the feed didn't work out because the guys were catching the darn fish out of the cage, and they were cooking them, they were frying them up and having them for dinner. So anyway, that was kind of but Booker was always experimenting with things, and that was another experiment that, that he tried, and it didn't quite work out, but it led me to the point to where I am now, I must say.
Marlene Holmes spent 27 years at Jim Beam before she headed south to join Milam and Green, and thanks to Marlene for sharing that story with us. If there's something you'd like us to look at on an upcoming episode, just use the contact form at WhiskyCast.com to get in touch with us. Behind the Label is brought to you by Writer's Tears.
Writer's Tears Copper Pot, an 18th century style of premium Irish whiskey, blended from single pot still and single malt. Like yourself, it's one of life's treasured rarities, and what's rare is wonderful. Writer's Tears Copper Pot.
That's all for this edition of WhiskyCast. You'll find links for the stories in this episode in our show notes at WhiskyCast.com. That's also where you'll find the latest whiskey news, my tasting notes, the calendar of events, the whiskey photo of the week, and, of course, a complete archive of past episodes that goes all the way back to 2005. We'd love to hear from you. You can always get in touch with us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at WhiskyCast. The email address is comments@whiskycast.com.
When you land on something special, you just know. Redbreast, the quintessential single pot still Irish whiskey, and a proud sponsor of WhiskyCast.
At Doers, we love a good story, and that's why we're always writing new chapters. Like our Caribbean Smooth whiskey finished in rum casks with notes of brown sugar, tropical fruits, and caramel. As a 174-year-old brand, we could rest on our laurels. Instead, we'd much rather continue writing, because when you keep telling the same old story, that's when people stop listening.
WhiskyCast is a production of Cask Strength Media, copyright 2020, and comes to you from the charming, yet regrettably dry town of Haddonfield, New Jersey. I'm Mark Gillespie, reminding you that when you drink, please drink responsibly. Thanks for listening, and please stay safe.